It's a tragedy that begins on the night of the 1st of June 2009. Flight 447 with destination Paris disappear from the radar, to be never seen again in one piece, with 228 passengers and crew. Find out more about the tragedy of Air France 447. Air France Flight 447 was a scheduled international passenger flight from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, to Paris, France. The aircraft involved in the accident was a 4-year-old Airbus A330-200, with manufacturer serial number 660, registered as Foxtrot Golf Zulu Charlie Papa. Its first flight was on the 25th of February 2005, and it was delivered 2 months later to the airline on the 18th of April 2005. At the time of the crash, it was Air France's newest A330. The aircraft was carrying 216 passengers, 3 aircrew, and 9 cabin crew in 2 cabins of service. 3 pilots were in the aircrew. The captain, 58-year-old Marc Dubois, PNF pilot not flying, had joined Air Inter, which later merged into Air France, in February 1988, and had 10,988 flying hours, of which 6,258 were as captain, including 1,700 hours on the Airbus A330. He had carried out 16 rotations in the South America sector since arriving in the A330, A340 division in 2007. The first officer, co-pilot in left seat, 37-year-old David Robert, PNF, had joined Air France in July 1998 and had 6,547 flying hours, of which 4,479 hours were on the Airbus A330. He had carried out 39 rotations in the South America sector since arriving in the A330, A340 division in 2002. Robert had graduated from École Nationale de l'Aviation Civile, one of the elite Grandes Écoles, and had transitioned from a pilot to a management job at the airline's operations center. He served as a pilot on this flight to maintain his flying credentials. The first officer, co-pilot in right seat, 32-year-old Pierre-Cédric Bonin, PF pilot flying, had joined Air France in October 2003 and had 2,936 flight hours, of which 807 hours were on the Airbus A330. He had carried out 5 rotations in the South America sector since arriving in the A330, A340 division in 2008. His wife Isabelle, a physics teacher, was also on board. Of the 12 crew members, including aircrew and cabin crew, 11 were French and 1 was Brazilian. The majority of passengers were French, Brazilian, or German citizens. The passengers included business and holiday travelers. The aircraft departed from Rio de Janeiro Galeão International Airport on the 31st of May 2009 at 1929 Brazilian Standard Time, with a scheduled arrival at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport at 11:03 Central European Summertime the following day. Voice contact with the aircraft was lost around 1:35, 3 hours and 6 minutes after departure. The last message reported that the aircraft had passed waypoint INTOL, located 565 kilometers off Natal, on Brazil's northeastern coast. The aircraft left Brazilian Atlantic radar surveillance at 1:49, and entered a communication dead zone. The Airbus A330 is designed to be flown by 2 pilots, but the 13-hour duty time, the total flight duration, as well as pre-flight preparation, required for the Rio-Paris route exceeded the 10 hours permitted before a pilot had to take a break as dictated by Air France's procedures. To comply with these procedures, Flight 447 was crewed by 3 pilots, a captain and 2 first officers. With 3 pilots on board, each pilot could take a break in the A330's rest cabin, located behind the cockpit. In accordance with common practice, Captain Dubois sent one of the co-pilots for the first rest period with the intention of taking the second break himself. At 1:55, he woke up First Officer Robert and said, "He's going to take my place." After attending the briefing between the 2 co-pilots, the captain left the cockpit to rest at 2 hours 1 minute and 46 seconds. At 2:06, the pilot warned the cabin crew that they were about to enter an area of turbulence. About 2 to 3 minutes later, the aircraft encountered icing conditions. The cockpit voice recorder, CVR, recorded sounds akin to hail or grapple on the outside of the aircraft, and ice crystals began to accumulate in the pitot tubes, which measure airspeed. The other first officer, Bonin, turned the aircraft slightly to the left and decreased its speed from Mach 0.82 to 0.80, which was the recommended speed to penetrate turbulence. The engine anti-ice system was also turned on. At 2 hours 10 minutes and 5 seconds, the autopilot disengaged, most likely because the pitot tubes had icing, and the aircraft transitioned from normal law to alternate law 2. The engine's auto thrust systems disengaged 3 seconds later. As the PF, Bonin took over control of the aircraft, using the command language, "I have the controls." Without the autopilot, turbulence caused the aircraft to start to roll to the right, and Bonin reacted by deflecting his side stick to the left. One consequence of the change to alternate law was an increase in the aircraft's sensitivity to roll, and the pilot overcorrected. During the next 30 seconds, the aircraft rolled alternately left and right as he adjusted to the altered handling characteristics of the aircraft. At the same time, he abruptly pulled back on his side stick, raising the nose. This action has been described as unnecessary and excessive under the circumstances. The aircraft's stall warning briefly sounded twice because the angle of attack tolerance was exceeded, and the aircraft's indicated airspeed dropped sharply from 274 knots to 52 knots. The aircraft's angle of attack increased, and the aircraft subsequently began to climb above its cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, FL 350. During this ascent, the aircraft attained vertical speeds well in excess of the typical rate of climb for the Airbus A330, which usually ascend at rates no greater than 2,000 feet per minute, 10 meters per second. The aircraft experienced a peak vertical speed close to 7,000 feet per minute, which occurred as Bonin brought the rolling movements under control. At 2 hours 11 minutes and 10 seconds, the aircraft had climbed to its maximum altitude around 38,000 feet, 11,582 meters. At this point, the aircraft's angle of attack was 16 degrees, and the engine thrust levers were in the fully forward takeoff, go around, toga, detent. As the aircraft began to descend, the angle of attack rapidly increased toward 30 degrees. A second consequence of the reconfiguration into alternate law was that the stall protection no longer operated, whereas in normal law, the aircraft's flight management computers would have acted to prevent such a high angle of attack. The wings lost lift and the aircraft began to stall. Confused, Bonin exclaimed, "I don't have control of the airplane anymore now," and 2 seconds later, "I don't have control of the airplane at all." Robert responded to this by saying, "Controls to the left," and took over control of the aircraft. He pushed his side stick forward to lower the nose and recover from the stall. However, Bonin was still pulling his side stick back. The inputs cancelled each other out and triggered an oral, dual input, warning. At 2 hours 11 minutes and 40 seconds, Captain Dubois re-entered the cockpit after being summoned by Robert. Noticing the various alarms going off, he asked the 2 crew members, What are you doing?" The angle of attack had then reached 40 degrees, and the aircraft had descended to 35,000 feet, 10,668 meters, with the engines running at almost 100% N1, the rotational speed of the front intake fan, which delivers most of a turbofan engine's thrust. The stall warning stopped, as all airspeed indications were now considered invalid by the aircraft's computer because of the high angle of attack. The aircraft had its nose above the horizon, but was descending steeply. Roughly 20 seconds later, at 2:12, Bonin decreased the aircraft's pitch slightly. Airspeed indications became valid, and the stall warning sounded again. It then sounded intermittently for the remaining duration of the flight, stopping only when the pilots increased the aircraft's nose-up pitch. From there until the end of the flight, the angle of attack never dropped below 35 degrees. From the time the aircraft stalled until its impact into the ocean, the engines were primarily developing either 100% N1 or toga thrust, though they were briefly spooled down to about 50% N1 on 2 occasions. The engines always responded to commands and were developing in excess of 100% N1 when the flight ended. Robert responded to Dubois by saying, "We've lost all control of the aeroplane, we don't understand anything, we've tried everything." Soon after this, Robert said to himself, "Climb 4 consecutive times." Bonin heard this and replied, "But I've been at maximum nose-up for a while." When Captain Dubois heard this, he realized Bonin was causing the stall, and shouted, "No, no, no, don't climb. No, no, no." When Robert heard this, he told Bonin to give him control of the airplane. In response to this, Bonin temporarily gave the controls to Robert. Robert pushed his side stick forward to try to regain lift for the airplane to climb out of the stall. However, the aircraft was too low to recover from the stall. Shortly thereafter, the ground proximity warning system sounded an alarm, warning the crew about the aircraft's imminent crash with the ocean. In response, Bonin, without informing his colleagues, pulled his side stick all the way back again, and said, "We're going to crash. This can't be true, but what's happening?" The last recording on the CVR was Dubois saying, 10 degrees pitch attitude. The flight data recorders stopped recording at 2 hours 14 minutes and 28 seconds, 3 hours and 45 minutes after takeoff. At that point, the aircraft's ground speed was recorded as 107 knots, and that the aircraft was descending at 10,912 feet per minute, 55.43 meters per second, of vertical speed. Its pitch was 16.2 degrees nose-up, with a roll angle of 5.3 degrees to the left. During its descent, the aircraft had turned more than 180 degrees to the right to a compass heading of 270 degrees. The aircraft remained stalled during its entire 3-minute 30-second descent from 38,000 feet, 12,000 meters. All 228 passengers and crew on board died on impact from extreme trauma and the aircraft was destroyed. Flight 447 was due to pass from Brazilian airspace into Senegalese airspace around 2:20 UTC on the 1st of June, and then into Cape Verdean airspace at roughly 3:45. Shortly after 4 o'clock, when the flight had failed to contact air traffic control in either Senegal or Cape Verde, the controller in Senegal attempted to contact the aircraft. When he received no response, he asked the crew of another Air France flight, AF459, to try to contact AF447. This also met with no success. After further attempts to contact Flight 447 were unsuccessful, an aerial search for the missing Airbus commenced from both sides of the Atlantic. Brazilian Air Force aircraft from the archipelago of Fernando de Noronha and French reconnaissance aircraft based in Dakar, Senegal, led the search. They were assisted by a Casa 235 maritime patrol aircraft from Spain and a United States Navy Lockheed Martin P-3 Orion anti-submarine warfare and maritime patrol aircraft. By early afternoon on the 1st of June, officials with Air France and the French government had already presumed the aircraft had been lost with no survivors. An Air France spokesperson told L'Express that no hope for survivors remained, and French President Nicolas Sarkozy announced almost no chance existed for anyone to have survived. On the 2nd of June at 15:20 UTC, a Brazilian Air Force Embraer R-99A spotted wreckage and signs of oil, possibly jet fuel, strewn along a 5 km band 650 km northeast of Fernando de Noronha Island, near the St. Peter and St. Paul archipelago. The sighted wreckage included an aircraft seat, an orange buoy, a barrel, and white pieces and electrical conductors. Later that day, after meeting with relatives of the Brazilians on the aircraft, Brazilian Defense Minister Nelson Jobim announced that the Air Force believed the wreckage was from Flight 447. Brazilian Vice President José Alencar, acting as president since Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva was out of the country, declared 3 days of official mourning. Also on the 2nd of June, 2 French Navy vessels, the frigate Ventos and helicopter carrier Mistral, were en route to the suspected crash site. Other ships sent to the site included the French research vessel Pourquoi Pas, equipped with 2 mini-submarines able to descend to 6,000 meters, 20,000 feet, since the area of the Atlantic in which the aircraft went down was thought to be as deep as 4,700 meters, 15,400 feet. On the 3rd of June, the first Brazilian Navy, the Marinha do Brasil, or MB, ship, the patrol boat Graju, reached the area in which the first debris was spotted. The Brazilian Navy sent a total of 5 ships to the debris site. The frigate Constituição and the corvette Caboclo were scheduled to reach the area on the 4th of June, the frigate Bociccio on the 6th of June and the replenishment oiler Almirante Gastão Mata on the 7th of June. Early on the 6th of June 2009, 5 days after Flight 447 disappeared, 2 male bodies, the first to be recovered from the crashed aircraft, were brought on board the Caboclo, along with a seat, a nylon backpack containing a computer and vaccination card, and a leather briefcase containing a boarding pass for the Air France flight. Initially, media, including the Boston Globe, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chicago Tribune, cited unnamed investigators in their reporting that the recovered bodies were naked, which implied the plane had broken up at high altitude. However, the notion that the aircraft fragmented while airborne ultimately was refuted by investigators. At this point, on the evidence of the recovered bodies and materials, investigators confirmed the plane had crashed, killing everyone on board. The following day, the 7th of June, search crews recovered the Airbus's vertical stabilizer, the first major piece of wreckage to be discovered. Pictures of this part being lifted onto the Constituição became a poignant symbol of the loss of the Air France craft. The search and recovery effort reached its peak over the next week or so, as the number of personnel mobilized by the Brazilian military exceeded 1,100. 15 aircraft, including 2 helicopters, were devoted to the search mission. The Brazilian Air Force Embraer R99 flew for more than 100 hours, and electronically scanned more than 1 million square kilometers of ocean. Other aircraft involved in the search scanned, visually, 320,000 square kilometers of ocean and were used to direct Navy vessels involved in the recovery effort. By the 16th of June 2009, 50 bodies had been recovered from a wide area of the ocean. They were transported to shore, first by the frigates Constituição and Bociccio to the islands of Fernando de Noronha, and thereafter by air to Recife for identification. Pathologists identified all 50 bodies recovered from the crash site, including that of the captain, by using dental records and fingerprints. The search teams logged the time and location of every find in a database which, by the time the search ended on the 26th of June, catalogued 640 items of debris from the aircraft. The B documented the timeline of discoveries in its first interim report. On the 5th of June 2009, the French nuclear submarine Emeraude was dispatched to the crash zone, arriving in the area on the 10th. Its mission was to assist in the search for the missing flight recorders or black boxes that might be located at great depth. The submarine would use its sonar to listen for the ultrasonic signal emitted by the black box's pingers, covering 13 square miles per day. The Emeraude was to work with the mini-sub Naudil, which can descend to the ocean floor. The French submarines would be aided by 2 U.S. underwater audio devices capable of picking up signals at a depth of 20,000 feet. Following the end of the search for bodies, the search continued for the Airbus's black boxes, the cockpit voice recorder, CVR, and the flight data recorder, FDR. French Bureau of Enquiry and Analysis for Civil Aviation Safety, B. Chief Paul-Louis Arslanian said that he was not optimistic about finding them since they might have been under as much as 3,000 meters, 9,800 feet, of water, and the terrain under this portion of the ocean was very rugged. Investigators were hoping to find the aircraft's lower aft section, for that was where the recorders were located. Although France had never recovered a flight recorder from such depths, there was precedent for such an operation. In 1988, an independent contractor recovered the CVR of South African Airways Flight 295 from a depth of 4,900 meters, 16,100 feet, in a search area of between 80 and 250 square nautical miles. The Air France flight recorders were fitted with water-activated acoustic underwater locator beacons or pingers, which should have remained active for at least 30 days, giving searchers that much time to locate the origin of the signals. France requested 2 towed pinger locator hydrophones from the United States Navy to help find the aircraft. The French nuclear submarine and 2 French contracted ships, the Fairmount Expedition and the Fairmount Glacier, towing the U.S. Navy listening devices, trawled a search area with a radius of 80 kilometers, 50 miles, centered on the aircraft's last known position. By mid-July, recovery of the black boxes still had not been announced. The finite beacon battery life meant that, as the time since the crash elapsed, the likelihood of location diminished. In late July, the search for the black boxes entered its second phase, with a French research vessel resuming the search using a towed sonar array. The second phase of the search ended on the 20th of August without finding wreckage within a 75 km radius of the last position, as reported at 2:10. The third phase of the search for the recorders lasted from the 2nd of April until the 24th of May 2010, and was conducted by 2 ships, the Anne Candies and the Seabed Worker. The Anne Candies towed a U.S. Navy sonar array, while the Seabed Worker operated 3 robot submarines. AUV Abyss. Air France and Airbus jointly funded the third phase of the search. The search covered an area of 6,300 square kilometers, mostly to the north and northwest of the aircraft's last known position. The search area had been drawn up by oceanographers from France, Russia, Great Britain and the United States, combining data on the location of floating bodies and wreckage, and currents in the mid-Atlantic in the days immediately after the crash. A smaller area to the southwest was also searched, based on a re-analysis of sonar recordings made by Emerald the previous year. The third phase of the search ended on the 24th of May 2010 without any success, though the B says that the search nearly covered the whole area drawn up by investigators. In July 2010, the US-based search consultancy Metron, Inc. had been engaged to draw up a probability map of where to focus the search, based on prior probabilities from flight data and local condition reports, combined with the results from the previous searches. The Metron team used what it described as classic Bayesian search methods, an approach that had previously been successful in the search for the submarine USS Scorpion and SS Central America. Phase 4 of the search operation started close to the aircraft's last known position, which was identified by the Metron study as being the most likely resting place of Flight 447. Within a week of resuming of the search operation, on the 3rd of April 2011, a team led by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution operating full ocean depth autonomous underwater vehicles, AUVs, owned by the Waite Institute, discovered, by means of sidescan sonar, a large portion of the debris field from flight AF447. Further debris and bodies, still trapped in the partly intact remains of the aircraft's fuselage, were at a depth of 3,980 meters. The debris was found lying in a relatively flat and silty area of the ocean floor, as opposed to the extremely mountainous topography originally believed to be AF447's final resting place. Other items found were engines, wing parts and the landing gear. The debris field was described as quite compact, measuring 200 by 600 meters and a short distance north of where pieces of wreckage had been recovered previously, suggesting the aircraft hit the water largely intact. The French Ecology and Transportation Minister Nathalie Kosciusko-Morizet stated the bodies and wreckage would be brought to the surface and taken to France for examination and identification. The French government chartered the Ile de Seine to recover the flight recorders from the wreckage. An American Remora 6000 remotely operated vehicle, ROV, and operations crew from Phoenix International experienced in the recovery of aircraft for the United States Navy were on board the Ile de Seine. Ile de Seine arrived at the crash site on the 26th of April, and during its first dive, the Remora 6000 found the flight data recorder chassis, although without the crash survivable memory unit. On the 1st of May the memory unit was found and lifted on board the Ile de Seine by the ROV. The aircraft's cockpit voice recorder was found on the 2nd of May 2011, and was raised and brought on board the Ile de Seine the following day. On the 7th of May, the flight recorders, under judicial seal, were taken aboard the French Navy patrol boat Le Capricieuse for transfer to the port of Cayenne. From there they were transported by air to the B's office in Le Bourget near Paris for data download and analysis. One engine in the avionics bay, containing onboard computers, had also been raised. By the 15th of May, all the data from both the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder had been downloaded. The data was analyzed over the following weeks, and the findings published in the third interim report at the end of July. The entire download was filmed and recorded. Between the 5th of May and the 3rd of June 2011, 104 bodies were recovered from the wreckage, bringing the total number of bodies found to 154. 50 bodies had been previously recovered from the sea. The search ended with the remaining 74 bodies still not recovered. The French authorities opened 2 investigations. A criminal investigation for manslaughter began on 5 June 2009, under the supervision of investigating magistrate Sylvie Zimmermann from the Paris Tribunal de Grande Instance. The judge gave the investigation to the Gendarmerie Nationale, which would conduct it through its Aerial Transportation Division, Gendarmerie des Transports Aériens or GTA, and its Forensic Research Institute, the Institut de Recherche Criminelle de la Gendarmerie Nationale, FR. As part of the criminal investigation, the DGSE, the external French intelligence agency, examined the names of passengers on board for any possible links to terrorist groups. In March 2011, a French judge filed preliminary manslaughter charges against Air France and Airbus over the crash. A technical investigation was started, the goal of which was to enhance the safety of future flights. In accordance with the provisions of ICAO Annex 13, the B participated in the investigation as representative for the state, country, of manufacture of the Airbus. The Brazilian Air Force's Aeronautical Accidents Investigation and Prevention Center, CENIPA, the German Federal Bureau of Aircraft Accident Investigation, BFU, the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AAIB, and the US National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, also became involved in accordance with these provisions. The NTSB became involved as the representative of the state of manufacture of the General Electric turbine engines installed on the plane, and the other representatives could supply important information. The People's Republic of China, Croatia, Hungary, Republic of Ireland, Italy, Lebanon, Morocco, Norway, South Korea, Russia, South Africa, and Switzerland appointed observers, since citizens of those countries were on board. On 5 June 2009, the B cautioned against premature speculation as to the cause of the crash. At that time, the investigation had established only 2 facts. The weather near the aircraft's planned route included significant convective cells typical of the equatorial regions, and the speeds measured by the 3 Pitot tubes differed from each other during the last few minutes of the flight. On 2 July 2009, the B released an intermediate report, which described all known facts, and a summary of the visual examination of the rudder and the other parts of the aircraft that had been recovered at that time. According to the B, this examination showed the airliner was likely to have struck the surface of the sea in a normal flight attitude, with a high rate of descent. No signs of any fires or explosions were found. The airliner did not break up in flight. The report also stresses that the B had not had access to the post-mortem reports at the time of its writing. On 16 May 2011, Le Figaro reported that the B investigators had ruled out an aircraft malfunction as the cause of the crash, according to preliminary information extracted from the FDR. The following day, the B issued a press release explicitly describing the Le Figaro report as a sensationalist publication of non-validated information. The B stated that no conclusions had been made, investigations were continuing, and no interim report was expected before the summer. On 18 May, the head of the investigation further stated no major malfunction of the aircraft had been found so far in the data from the flight data recorder, but that minor malfunctions had not been ruled out. In the minutes before its disappearance, the aircraft's onboard systems sent a number of messages, via the ACARS, indicating disagreement in the indicated airspeed readings. A spokesperson for the B claimed, the airspeed of the aircraft was unclear to the pilots and, on 4 June 2009, Airbus issued an accident information telex to operators of all its aircraft reminding pilots of the recommended abnormal and emergency procedures to be taken in the case of unreliable airspeed indication. French Transport Minister Dominique Bussereau said, obviously, the pilots, of Flight 447, did not have the speed showing, which can lead to 2 bad consequences for the life of the aircraft: underspeed, which can lead to a stall, and overspeed, which can lead to the aircraft breaking up because it is approaching the speed of sound and the structure of the plane is not made for enduring such speeds. Between May 2008 and March 2009, 9 incidents involving the temporary loss of airspeed indication appeared in the air safety reports for Air France's A330, A340 fleet. All occurred in cruise between flight levels FL 310 and FL 380. Further, after the Flight 447 accident, Air France identified 6 additional incidents that had not been reported on ASRs. These were intended for maintenance aircraft technical logs drawn up by the pilots to describe these incidents only partially, to indicate the characteristic symptoms of the incidents associated with unreliable airspeed readings. The problems primarily occurred in 2007 on the A320, but awaiting a recommendation from Airbus, Air France delayed installing new Pitot tubes on A330, A340 and increased inspection frequencies in these aircraft. When it was introduced in 1994, the Airbus A330 was equipped with Pitot tubes, part number 0851GR, manufactured by Goodrich Sensors and Integrated Systems. A 2001 airworthiness directive required these to be replaced with either a later Goodrich design, part number 0851HL, or with Pitot tubes made by Thales, part number C16195AA. Air France chose to equip its fleet with the Thales Pitot tubes. In September 2007, Airbus recommended that Thales C16195AA Pitot tubes should be replaced by Thales model C16195BA to address the problem of water ingress that had been observed. Since it was not an AD, the guidelines allowed the operator to apply the recommendations at its discretion. Air France implemented the change on its A320 fleet, on which the incidents of water ingress were observed, and decided to do so in its A330-340th fleet only when failures started to occur in May 2008. After discussing these issues with the manufacturer, Air France sought a means of reducing these incidents, and Airbus indicated that the new Pitot probe designed for the A320 was not designed to prevent cruise-level iceover. In 2009, tests suggested that the new probe could improve its reliability, prompting Air France to accelerate the replacement program, which started on the 29th of May. FGZCP was scheduled to have its Pitot tubes replaced as soon as it returned to Paris. By the 17th of June 2009, Air France had replaced all Pitot probes on its A330 type aircraft. In July 2009, Airbus issued new advice to A330 and A340 operators to exchange Thales Pitot tubes for tubes from Goodrich. On the 12th of August 2009, Airbus issued 3 mandatory service bulletins, requiring that all A330 and A340 aircraft be fitted with 2 Goodrich 0851HL Pitot tubes and 1 Thales model C16195BA Pitot, or, alternatively, 3 of the Goodrich Pitot tubes, Thales model C16195AA Pitot tubes were no longer to be used. This requirement was incorporated into ADs issued by the European Aviation Safety Agency on the 31st of August and by the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, on the 3rd of September. The replacement was to be completed by the 7th of January 2010. According to the FAA, in its Federal Register publication, use of the Thales model has resulted in reports of airspeed indication discrepancies while flying at high altitudes in inclement weather conditions that could result in reduced control of the airplane. The FAA further stated that the Thales model probe has not yet demonstrated the same level of robustness to withstand high-altitude ice crystals as Goodrich Pitot probes P.N0851HL. On the 20th of December 2010, Airbus issued a warning to roughly 100 operators of A330, A340-200, and A340-300 aircraft regarding Pitot tubes, advising pilots not to re-engage the autopilot following failure of the airspeed indicators. Safety recommendations issued by B for Pitot probes design recommended they must be fitted with a heating system designed to prevent any malfunctioning due to icing. Appropriate means must be provided, visual warning directly visible to the crew, to inform the crew of any non-functioning of the heating system. On the 27th of May 2011, the B released an update on its investigation describing the history of the flight as recorded by the FDR. This confirmed what had previously been concluded from post-mortem examination of the bodies and debris recovered from the ocean surface. The aircraft had not broken up at altitude, but had fallen into the ocean intact. The FDRs also revealed that the aircraft's descent into the sea was not due to mechanical failure or the aircraft being overwhelmed by the weather, but because the flight crew had raised the aircraft's nose, reducing its speed until it entered an aerodynamic stall. While the inconsistent airspeed data caused the disengagement of the autopilot, the reason the pilots lost control of the aircraft had remained a mystery, in particular because pilots would normally try to lower the nose in the event of a stall. Multiple sensors provide the pitch, attitude, information, and no indication was given that any of them were malfunctioning. One factor may be that since the A330 does not normally accept control inputs that would cause a stall, the pilots were unaware that a stall could happen when the aircraft switched to an alternate mode because of failure of the airspeed indication. In October 2011, a transcript of the CVR was leaked and published in the book Erreurs de pilotage, Pilot Errors, by Jean-Pierre Otelli. The B and Air France both condemned the release of this information, with Air France calling it sensationalized and unverifiable information that impairs the memory of the crew and passengers who lost their lives. The B subsequently released its final report on the accident, and Appendix 1 contained an official CVR transcript that did not include groups of words deemed to have no bearing on flight. On the 29th of July 2011, the B released a third interim report on safety issues it found in the wake of the crash. It was accompanied by two shorter documents summarizing the interim report and addressing safety recommendations. The third interim report stated that some new facts had been established. In particular, the pilots had not applied the unreliable airspeed procedure. The pilot in control pulled back on the stick, thus increasing the angle of attack and causing the aircraft to climb rapidly. The pilots apparently did not notice that the aircraft had reached its maximum permissible altitude. The pilots did not read out the available data, vertical velocity, altitude, etc. The stall warning sounded continuously for 54 seconds. The pilots did not comment on the stall warnings and apparently did not realize that the aircraft was stalled. There was some buffeting associated with the stall. The stall warning deactivates by design when the angle of attack measurements are considered invalid, and this is the case when the airspeed drops below a certain limit. In consequence, the stall warning came on whenever the pilot pushed forward on the stick and then stopped when he pulled back. This happened several times during the stall, and this may have confused the pilots. Despite the fact that they were aware that altitude was declining rapidly, the pilots were unable to determine which instruments to trust. All values may have appeared to them to be incoherent. The B assembled a human factors working group to analyze the crew's actions and reactions during the final stages of the flight. A brief bulletin by Air France indicated the misleading stopping and starting of the stall warning alarm, contradicting the actual state of the aircraft, greatly contributed to the crew's difficulty in analyzing the situation. On the 5th of July 2012, the B released its final report on the accident. This confirmed the findings of the preliminary reports and provided additional details and recommendations to improve safety. According to the final report, the accident resulted from this succession of major events: temporary inconsistency between the measured speeds, likely as a result of the obstruction of the Pitot tubes by ice crystals, caused autopilot disconnection and reconfiguration to alternate law. The crew made inappropriate control inputs that destabilized the flight path. The crew failed to follow appropriate procedure for loss of displayed airspeed information. The crew were late in identifying and correcting the deviation from the flight path. The crew lacked understanding of the approach to stall. The crew failed to recognize the aircraft had stalled, and consequently did not make inputs that would have made recovering from the stall possible. These events resulted from these major factors in combination. Feedback mechanisms between all those involved. The report identifies manufacturers, operators, flight crews, and regulatory agencies, which made it impossible to identify repeated non-application of the loss of airspeed information procedure, and to ensure that crews were trained in icing of the Pitot probes and its consequences. The crew's lack of practical training in manually handling the aircraft both at high altitude and in the event of anomalies of speed indication. The weakening of the two co-pilots' task sharing, both by incomprehension of the situation at the time of autopilot disconnection and by poor management of the startle effect, leaving them in an emotionally charged state. The cockpit's lack of a clear display of the inconsistencies in airspeed readings identified by the flight computers. The crew's lack of response to the stall warning, whether due to a failure to identify the oral warning, to the transience of the stall warnings that could have been considered spurious, to the absence of any visual information that could confirm that the aircraft was approaching stall after losing the characteristic speeds, to confusing stall-related buffet for overspeed-related buffet, to the indications by the flight director that might have confirmed the crew's mistaken view of their actions, or to difficulty in identifying and understanding the implications of the switch to alternate law, which does not protect the angle of attack. Before and after the publication of the final report by the B in July 2012, Many independent analyses and expert opinions were published in the media about the cause of the accident. In May 2011, Will S. Hilton of the New York Times commented that the crash was easy to bend into myth, because no other passenger jet in modern history had disappeared so completely, without a mayday call or a witness or even a trace on radar. Hilton explained that the A330 was considered to be among the safest of the passenger aircraft. Hilton added that when Flight 447 seemed to disappear from the sky, it was tempting to deliver a tidy narrative about the hubris of building a self-flying aircraft, Icarus falling from the sky. Or maybe Flight 447 was the Titanic, an uncrashable ship at the bottom of the sea. Dr. Guy Grattan, an aviation expert from the Flight Safety Laboratory at Brunel University, said, "This is an air accident the likes of which we haven't seen before. Half the accident investigators in the Western world, and in Russia too, are waiting for these results. This has been the biggest investigation since Lockerbie. Put bluntly, big passenger planes do not just fall out of the sky." In a July 2011 article in Aviation Week, Chesley Sully Sullenberger was quoted as saying the crash was a seminal accident, and suggested that pilots would be able to better handle upsets of this type if they had an indication of the wing's angle of attack, AOA. By contrast, aviation author Captain Bill Palmer has expressed doubts that an AOA indicator would have saved AF447, writing, "As the PFs seem to be ignoring the more fundamental indicators of pitch and attitude, along with numerous stall warnings, one could question what difference a rarely used AOA gauge would have made." Following its investigation, the B recommended that the European Aviation Safety Agency and the FAA should consider making an AOA indicator on the instrument panel mandatory. In 2014, the FAA streamlined requirements for AOA indicators for general aviation without affecting requirements for commercial aviation. On the 6th of December 2011, Popular Mechanics published an English translation of the analysis of the transcript of the CVR controversially leaked in the book Erreurs de Pilotage. It highlighted the role of the co-pilot installing the aircraft, while the flight computer was under alternate law at high altitude. This simple but persistent human error was given as the most direct cause of this accident. In the commentary accompanying the article, they also noted that the failure to follow principles of crew resource management was a contributory factor. The final B report points to the human-computer interface, HCI, of the Airbus as a possible factor contributing to the crash. It provides an explanation for most of the pitch-up inputs by the pilot flying, left unexplained in the Popular Mechanics piece, namely that the flight director display was misleading. The pitch-up input at the beginning of the fatal sequence of events appears to be the consequence of an altimeter error. The investigators also pointed to the lack of a clear display of the airspeed inconsistencies, though the computers had identified them. Some systems generated failure messages only about the consequences, but never mentioned the origin of the problem. The investigators recommended a blocked pitot tube should be clearly indicated as such to the crew on the flight displays. The Daily Telegraph pointed out the absence of AOA information, which is so important in identifying and preventing a stall. The paper stated, though angle of attack readings are sent to onboard computers, there are no displays in modern jets to convey this critical information to the crews. Der Spiegel indicated the difficulty the pilots faced in diagnosing the problem. One alarm after another lit up the cockpit monitors. One after another, the autopilot, the automatic engine control system, and the flight computers shut themselves off. Against this backdrop of confusing information, difficulty with oral cognition, due to heavy buffeting from the storm, as well as the stall, and zero external visibility, the pilots had less than 3 minutes to identify the problem and take corrective action. The Der Spiegel report asserts that such a crash could happen again. In an article in Vanity Fair, William Languish noted that once the AOA was so extreme, the system rejected the data as invalid, and temporarily stopped the stall warnings, but this led to a perverse reversal that lasted nearly to the impact. Each time Bonin happened to lower the nose, rendering the angle of attack marginally less severe, the stall warning sounded again, a negative reinforcement that may have locked him into his pattern of pitching up, which increased the angle of attack and thus aggravated the stall. In April 2012 in the Daily Telegraph, British journalist Nick Ross published a comparison of Airbus and Boeing flight controls. Unlike the control yoke used on Boeing flight decks, the Airbus side stick controls give little visual feedback and no sensory or tactile feedback to the second pilot. The cockpit synthetic voice, however, does give an oral message, dual input, whenever opposite inputs are initiated by the pilots. Ross reasoned that this might in part explain why the PF's pilot flying fatal nose-up inputs were not countermanded by his two colleagues. In fact, B's final report, July 2012, page 177 said, during this 46-second period between the autopilot disconnection and the stall 2 warning, the C-chord warning, an altitude-related alarm, sounded for a total duration of 34 seconds, 31 seconds of which is a continuous alert, and the stall warning sounded for 2 seconds. The C-chord alert therefore saturated the oral environment within the cockpit. This oral environment certainly played a role in altering the crew's response to the situation. In a July 2012 CBS report, Sullenberger suggested the design of the Airbus cockpit might have been a factor in the accident. The flight controls are not mechanically linked between the two pilot seats, and Robert, the left seat pilot who believed he had taken over control of the aircraft, was not aware that Bonin continued to hold the stickback, which overrode Robert's own control. B's final report, July 2012, page 179 said, in fact the situation, with a high workload and multiple visual prompts, corresponds to a threshold in terms of being able to take into account an unusual oral warning. In an oral environment that was already saturated by the C-chord warning. Quote, getting enough sleep is a constant challenge for pilots of long-haul flights. Although the B could find no objective indications that the pilots of Flight 447 were suffering from fatigue, some exchanges recorded on the CVR, including a remark made by Captain Dubois that he had only slept an hour, could indicate the crew were not well rested before the flight. The co-pilots had spent 3 nights in Rio de Janeiro, but the B was unable to retrieve data regarding their rest and could not determine their activities during the stopover. Shortly after the crash, Air France changed the number of the regular Rio de Janeiro-Paris flight from AF447 to AF445. 6 months later, on the 30th of November 2009, Air France Flight 445, operated by another Airbus A330-203, registered FGZCK, made a mayday call because of severe turbulence around the same area and at a similar time to when Flight 447 was lost. Because the pilots could not obtain immediate permission from air traffic controllers to descend to a less turbulent altitude, the mayday was to alert other aircraft in the vicinity that the flight had deviated from its allocated flight level. This is standard contingency procedure when changing altitude without direct ATC authorization. After 30 minutes of moderate to severe turbulence, the flight continued normally. The flight landed safely in Paris 6 hours and 40 minutes after the mayday call. Several cases have occurred in which inaccurate airspeed information led to flight incidents on the A330 and A340. 2 of those incidents involved Pitot probes. In the first incident, an Air France A340-300, FGL-ZL, en route from Tokyo to Paris experienced an event at 31,000 feet, 9,400 meters, in which the airspeed was incorrectly reported and the autopilot automatically disengaged. Bad weather and obstructed drainage holes in all 3 Pitot probes were subsequently found to be the cause. In the second incident, an Air France A340-300, FGL-ZN, en route from Paris to New York encountered turbulence followed by the autoflight systems going offline, warnings over the accuracy of the reported airspeed, and 2 minutes of stall alerts. Another incident on TAM Flight 8091, from Miami to Rio de Janeiro on the 21st of May 2009, involving an A330-200, showed a sudden drop of outside air temperature, then loss of air data, the ADIRS, autopilot and autothrust. The aircraft descended 1,000 meters before being manually recovered using backup instruments. The NTSB also examined a similar 23 June 2009 incident on a Northwest Airlines flight from Hong Kong to Tokyo, concluding in both cases that the aircraft operating manual was sufficient to prevent a dangerous situation from occurring. Following the crash of Air France 447, other Airbus A330 operators studied their internal flight records to seek patterns. Delta Airlines analyzed the data of Northwest Airlines flights that occurred before the 2 companies merged and found a dozen incidents in which at least one of an A330's pitot tubes had briefly stopped working when the aircraft was flying through the ITCZ, the same location where Air France 447 crashed. Air France and Airbus have been investigated for manslaughter since 2011, but in 2019, prosecutors recommended dropping the case against Airbus and charging Air France with manslaughter and negligence, concluding, the airline was aware of technical problems with a key airspeed monitoring instrument on its planes but failed to train pilots to resolve them. The case against Airbus was dropped on the 22nd of July the same year. The case against Air France was dropped in September 2019 when magistrates said there were not enough grounds to prosecute. However, in 2021, a public prosecutor in Paris requested to have Airbus and Air France tried in a court of law in April. It was announced that both companies would be prosecuted over the crash. Lawyers for Airbus stated they would lodge an immediate appeal against the decision.